We are going to dive in. Our next panel will be moderated by Sunu Chandy, class of 1998, who served as our co-conference chair in September. And I have so appreciated her and getting to know her better over the last few years. She oversees the National Women's Legal Center's litigation efforts. She helped create the center's gender equity and build the policies and procedures for the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund. She serves on numerous boards and has earned many awards. She's also an award-winning poet, which she won a really big award recently, and maybe she'll dive into that story. I don't know if she will, but it was a great connection from women in the law, but she just does beautiful poetry, and she read us a beautiful poem in the fall, which I appreciated. Sunu, I'm so happy to know you and have you here today. This is really a fantastic panel, great lineup, and I will turn it over to you. Place your questions in the chat and we will try to call on you at the end if we can fit it in.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Miel and Amy and Jennifer and Jake and everyone involved on the back end in putting this wonderful day together. I was under many deadlines, but was still listening in and got many interesting takeaways. The last session was so inspiring and heartbreaking all at the same time. And my one takeaway from Dr. Darnisa was, is there a billing code for that? Which is really about, are you really going to be doing the work or not? So that's what I'm going to keep asking people when they give me little projects. Show us the money to pay for those projects, because it really does take a lot of effort. So I'm really excited about this session. We thought about it as how we can use our law degree to push for social good. And in our last conference, we were thinking about with the last administration and all of the attacks on so many of the communities that we care about and that we come from. And our panelists work in a range of areas within public interest law. And I'm excited to hear both about their journeys and also about an example of a case or a policy issue that they're working on. Before that, I'm going to share just a little bit of background. As Miel said, I'm a Northeastern grad from 1998. And my focus has been labor and employment law. And I've been at the National Women's Law Center for going on 4 years. Before that, I was mostly in the federal government, also in the state, in a local civil rights office doing workplace civil rights enforcement and litigation. When I want to talk a little bit about the National Women's Law Center and our approach to gender justice work, in all of our amicus briefs and cases, and I'll put some links in the chat, we always highlight LGBTQ individuals and women and girls of color to show how discrimination works in these intersectional ways and how we always need to name that and highlight that. And we do that across all the areas of our work. My colleague, Michelle Banker, will be talking about our work on the reproductive rights and health team. And we also do that on our workplace justice work, against sexual harassment, unequal pay, and with income security, and on our education team. So I will add some links to the chat so you can check out our work later. But as far as this conference goes, I want to also highlight that we are a women's rights group, and we're always thinking about how we talk about gender not in a binary way, and include individuals who are gender non-binary and gender non-conforming. And our work is that all of the discrimination that is based on sex is eliminated, and we work on preventing and addressing that. And we name our work in that way. With that, I'm going to start with my panelists, and we're going to do 2 rounds of sessions here. First, I've asked them to introduce themselves, their legal background, any of their other personal background, their community involvement, their career history, really anything that they want to share. I was trying to clean my desk this morning. It didn't happen, but I did find this little paperweight that says imagine. And I thought that was basically an important word to keep in mind, because when I was at Northeastern, knowing that people like Mary Bonato and Arish Yavad were out there doing the work, was so inspiring to me because I could see a future in the law for myself. And I hope that our panelists provide that for some of you. Okay, with that, I'm going to start with, I think, Sarah, and I think someone will be spotlighting the panelists as they come on. Sarah, Connie, Emily, Michelle, and Heather. They're going to introduce themselves and tell you about their backgrounds. And we're going to start with the first round with Sarah.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Sarah Schnorr. I'm currently of counsel in the Boston office of Locke Lord. I'm somewhat of a rarity in the big law today in that I am still at the same firm that I joined as a summer associate in 1978 and as a first-year associate in 1979. Back then, it was known as Palmer and Dodge. Today, thanks to multiple mergers, which has been the history of big law, we're now part of Locke Lord. I graduated from college in 1970, and like a lot of my classmates, I had no idea what I wanted to do. So I was fortunate enough to get a Fulbright fellowship, and I studied in Munich for a year. I still didn't know what I wanted to do with my life, so I came back and got a master's in teaching at Wesleyan, and then went on to teach high school English and German in Connecticut and here in Massachusetts for 4 years. I decided I didn't want to become a school administrator and there was no other career path, so I went to law school, following in the footsteps of several of my Harvard classmates. I went to Virginia. I was editor-in-chief of the Virginia Journal of International Law and ended up joining Palmer and Dodge directly out of law school. Why did I choose Palmer and Dodge? There were a couple of reasons. First, when I interviewed with three women partners in the firm, which was unheard of back in 1977 and 78. And that told me immediately that this was a firm whose culture was something that I really respected and wanted to get to know more about. At the firm, I ended up joining the commercial real estate department. Over the last 42 years, I've done every kind of commercial real estate deal you could think of. A large part of my work is representing really big companies doing really complicated real estate financings and development. But one of the very first projects I worked on at Palmer and Dodge as a summer associate was obtaining some amendments to the South End Urban Renewal Plan for a low-income housing group in the Via Victoria neighborhood of Boston, which I ended up representing for the next 20 years in helping them to do that. Right now, I'm, as I said, of counsel. Most of my work is in the affordable housing finance world involving state and local low-income housing and historic tax credits. But the other significant thing for me to share with everyone is I'm an out and proud trans woman. In 2009, as a senior partner at my firm, I transitioned quite publicly, fortunately with the support of my firm and my partners. And since then, I've continued to be active in the transgender rights community as I continue to do today. So I'll share a little bit more about that later.
Thank you. Next, we'll have Connie.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. This is amazing. I'm so honored to be a part of this. So my practice is in Charlotte, North Carolina. I've been in practice I'm in my 27th year. And my practice is primarily, but not solely, on LGBTQ law, nuts and bolts, wills, name and gender marker changes, family law, surrogacy, and some things like that. And so I will never be mistaken for an academic or one of you really smart people, but I do what I do on the front end, on the front lines, and it's meaningful for my clients and for myself. So I went to law school because I had been an activist, rabble rousing, marching in the street, stuffing envelopes, all the things that we used to do. And I figured out that I could go to law school and continue marching in the streets, but also be in meeting rooms and boardrooms and courtrooms and be able to do that and combine those two. And that's exactly what I've done. I'm kind of a professional gay around town, pretty well known in my little niche. And I very much enjoy what I do. So I chose Northeastern because of the co-op program and a learning. I'd been out of school for a few years when I decided what I wanted to do. And my career path has kind of been along the lines of, I didn't know what I couldn't do, so I just went ahead and did it. So I got out of law school. 2 days later, I came to North Carolina, failed the bar the first time I took it, passed it the second time. FYI, not being able to pass the bar the first time apparently has not impacted my ability to practice law successfully for 27 years. And so I built a practice. My plan, like many people, was to learn on somebody else's dime, and that didn't turn out to be my path either. And so I opened my own practice and had the standard desk that I sat behind with the 2 client chairs in front. And I was very happy for that desk because my knees were knocking together. I was scared to death. And the only thing I told myself was my clients didn't know that I had no idea what I was doing. And I came up with creative ways to buy myself time to figure out what I was doing. Things like, the law is an ever-changing entity, and, let me go. I want to get you the best answer possible. Let me go do some research and I'll get back to you, which is really like, I don't know, I'm going to have to figure this out. Things like that. The other thing that I had to work with is the fact that I'm an introvert, and going to bar functions or networking things are my idea of hell, and those don't work for me. I stand in the corner and basically just look like I don't want to be there, which is actually true. And so I had to figure out how to meet clients and build my practice within my within things that work for me. So what works for me and worked for as an activist is I love sitting on committees. I love volunteering. I love being on boards of directors. And that's how I met people, did my activism, and networked and built my practice. And that has worked. As you all know, boards of directors love having an attorney on the board. So that always worked out well for me. So one of the things that I did early on was plan a CLE with my local bar association. And this was in about 1997. And they told me that I couldn't call it, it was going to be lesbian and gay law, like lesbian and gay law 101 for attorneys or something like that. And they were pretty concerned about offending the old white guys. And so they wouldn't let me title it that. And I decided to lose the battle and win the war. And so we did the CLE. It was very good, very well attended. And a couple of years later, they came back to me and said, hey, will you do that CLE again? And I said, I'm happy to, one condition, we're going to call it what it is. And they've now done that CLE every couple of years since then, calling it, first it was lesbian gay law, then it became, LGBT. Now I think it's LGBTQ or LGBTQ plus. And so every year or every couple of years they do that, and I feel real good about that. 2 real quick stories, if I may, and that is about how my law degree and my practice has affected my relationship with my family. I'm the youngest. I have an older brother and an older sister, and when my brother married and went to adopt my sister-in-law's child from her previous marriage, they're in a different state. But my brother called me for free legal advice, right? We all know about that. And so I was able to talk to him about what the step-parent adoption would look like. And I saw a shift in our relationship after that, where I wasn't the little kid sister anymore. He actually saw me as an adult professional who knew a couple of things. And I really liked that. Lastly, my relationship with my parents, when I came out to them, they were accepting, but didn't really know what to do with me, or how to talk with me or talk about me with their friends. And at their church, they belonged to a fairly liberal church in Missouri, and their church had a group, and there were several gay men that were part of the group. And they asked me to come out and speak about LGBT law, which I did. And they got to see, the program went really well. and they got to see and hear from their friends about kind of how they appreciated that presentation. And I saw a shift in my folks. And then the other shift I saw is that these friends that they had made in their church group, Iowa got marriage equality pretty early in the process. And my parents, actually, from some of their friends from the church group who went to Iowa to get married, my parents actually attended a gay marriage before I did. So, you know, always a journey, always a journey. I think that's it for me. Thanks so much. I'll talk some more later. Bye.
Thank you for those really powerful and moving stories. Really, really appreciate that. Next, we're going to have Emily.
Hi, everybody. I'm Emily Rochon. I'm very happy to be here today amongst a very distinguished group of panelists. Hi, Miel. I graduated from Northeastern in 2013. It was my 4th degree and my last one, I think, hopefully. I have a background in environmental studies and biology and environmental toxicology. I got a master's in environmental toxicology because I was trying to avoid going to law school. After I got that master's, I realized that I wouldn't be happy until I had my law degree. So I came to Northeastern, and I have not regretted it for one moment. I've spent my career as an environmental advocate working in the US and internationally. I've spent a good chunk of my time working for Greenpeace, traveling the world and trying to shut down dirty coal-fired power plants while supporting the transition to renewable energy resources. At the moment, I'm living in Belgium, but working internationally. I have my own company called Renewable Futures, and I serve a variety of clients, both here in Europe and in the US, various projects. I'm one of those people that if you need somebody to stand up in a crowd full of people and say no and be the only one to do that, you know, come talk to me. That's been pretty much most of what I've done for a good chunk of my career. It may not seem like it, but there's a lot of swimming uphill in the energy industry, particularly as a young woman. It's a very male-dominated industry, no matter where you are. But I've always loved the work, and it presents a lot of challenges that you need to solve on multiple levels. It's not just about keeping the lights on, it's about making sure the electricity is affordable. It's about making sure that communities benefit. It's about making sure our air is clean. It's about tackling climate change, jobs, and so much more. One of my primary clients at the moment is Vineyard Wind, whom you may have seen in the news recently. They were just granted their final federal major permit from the Biden administration. I think it was last week now. It's a huge milestone in launching an offshore wind industry in the US, and Massachusetts, of course, is leading the way. Very proud and happy to play a very small part in doing that. My law degree is why I was able to do that. So I'm forever grateful to Northeastern for the opportunity that they gave me. I think one of the key things that I learned at law school was how to write. I already knew how to write, but I learned how to write better. So take advantage of that opportunity to hone your writing skills while in law school, because these days I spend most of my time writing all sorts of things: contracts, regulatory memorandums, legislation, regulations, bid documents, proposal documents, cover letters, press releases, FAQs. Being able to adapt your writing style to different audiences and different needs could be a great opportunity to launch a career for yourself. It certainly is what is keeping me employed these days. And I think just one other thing I would add for the moment, sort of dovetailing off of Connie's family stories, I would say for me, my law degree has been hugely meaningful. My mother died in January after being hit by a car while walking her dog, which is sad in and of itself, obviously. But because I have a law degree and I understand how things work, I have been able to manage the process well and understand what needs to be done to investigate her situation, to manage her estate, and to take care of everything. And I have a very small family, so it's really just myself and my 2 sisters, and I'm the oldest. So, you know, having a law degree not just enables you to empower and embolden yourself to do good things in your work life, but it also allows you to do good things and protect your family in your personal life. So I think that was one of the things I always mentioned when I came to law school and I came to Northeastern. I needed a law degree for all sorts of different reasons, but I, needed to be able to take care of my family, and my law degree has absolutely put me in a position to do that. So to the extent that that is useful for anybody, I offer that to the group.
Oh my goodness, thank you so much for sharing that. And I hope you see all the chat and all the sympathies and condolences to you. Next, we're going to have my colleague, Michelle.
Hi, everybody. And I just want to chime in and say, I'm so sorry, Emily, and I appreciate you sharing that story and that your law degree was able to provide some solace at such a difficult time. So I just wanted to say thank you to everybody for having me on this panel. It's such an impressive group of folks, and so I'm very grateful to be here. My name is Michelle Banker, and I work with Sunu at NWLC. And my title is Director of Reproductive Rights and Health Litigation. And so as that title suggests, I lead the litigation and amicus work on our reproductive rights and health team. So I graduated from law school in 2010. I went to University of Pennsylvania for law school. Before that, I worked in health policy. And when I was in law school, I knew that my passion was civil rights and reproductive rights in particular. But I will say that even though I participated in activities that were relevant to those passions, I didn't have a good sense of all the possible pathways for a career in the field. And I ended up taking a traditional pathway of going to a firm and clerking. I worked at a big law firm for a couple of years, and then I clerked on the US District Court for the Eastern District of New York. And I also worked for a small union side labor firm. So I just want to say there's absolutely nothing wrong with that pathway. But what I realized is that when you work in the law, you're working long hours. The work is hard. It's really in the weeds. And it's just so important to do what you're passionate about. And I realized the big law path wasn't for me. So after clerking, I made the transition to the work that I do now. And I guess I'll just say that I'll be honest that the transition wasn't easy. I was in a very fortunate position that I was able to take time to volunteer and take some lower paying jobs at reproductive rights and health organizations to get relevant experience. But I believe that if I had started earlier down the path, it probably would have been much easier to make that transition. So I encourage law students to explore career options relevant to their passions early. And if anybody wants to talk to me afterwards about the transition that I made and the pathway and the obstacles that I encountered and what it entailed, I'm happy to do so. So that's it. I'll pass it back to you, Sunu.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. And next we'll have Heather.
Hi, everyone. I'm Heather Yantz. I'm originally from Woodstock, Vermont, and I went to the University of North Carolina for college. I was not one of those people that immediately knew they wanted to be a lawyer, even though everybody in my life told me, oh, you should be a lawyer. And I think I really fought back against that. And it took me about 4 years after college of traveling and working with Habitat for Humanity for me to realize, indeed, they were all right and I should be a lawyer. And I graduated from Northeastern in 2007, and I see a bunch of 2007 grads on this panel, so I'm very excited to say hi to you guys for the first time in a long time. I clerked for Judge Kafker for a year in the Massachusetts Appeals Court, and then I worked at Greater Boston Legal Services in their immigration unit. And I'm a lifer for immigration law. I went from there to private practice and then pretty quickly got into criminal immigration and deportation defense, which is what I'm doing now. I'm at Demasay & Church, which is a firm in Cambridge. We do public interest law and high impact cases. But my life as a deportation defense attorney kind of has a lot of different avenues. So in pre-COVID times, I'd spend at least a day a week in jail, meeting with my clients, a day in immigration court, trying to convince the judge that my client would be killed if they were forced to return to their home countries. I'd be in the ICE office saying, please don't deport my client today. She has cancer, or she has a newborn baby. Or I'd be in the asylum office or the immigration office, or increasingly in federal court, especially during the Trump administration. So Susan Church, my partner, and I were the two attorneys that litigated the Muslim ban here in Boston. We found some plaintiffs at Logan Airport and were able to get one of the first and one of the strongest injunctions against Trump's Muslim ban. And I think what these last 4 years have really taught me is how to pivot and how to deal with my own trauma around what I was seeing and experiencing. It's nothing compared with what my clients have been through, but it has certainly impacted my professional life and my personal life. I would find myself tearing up, putting my own children to bed, thinking of my clients who were not able to do so, and feeling really guilty for how many nights I missed putting my children to bed as I drank from the fire hose of the Trump administration. The family separation work has really changed me. The work I've done on the border, I volunteered with Al Otro Lado, which is a group in Tijuana, and I was able to work with families that were living in danger every day in either tent camps or shelters that were overcrowded. As a migrant in Mexico, you are severely targeted because everybody knows that you don't have contacts necessarily, that you're living kind of on your own. You have all your worldly possessions with you. You have young children with you. And I would have to work with them on their credible fear claims and trying to get into the United States to ask for asylum through the port of border entry. And that was very difficult. In Boston, if I were to litigate a claim like that, it would be 10 to 15 hours worth of work. I usually had about 10 minutes with them on the border. I felt like a first responder lawyer, and that was really scary and hard. And there were times that I didn't feel safe myself. So I am happy that we are under the Biden administration. I think there's a lot more that he can do. But at the same time, I don't feel the chaos that I felt for the last 4 years during Trump's time. Thank you.
Thank you all. This was such an incredible panel, and it's so wonderful to hear about everyone's path and focus. And we're going to do one more round of speaking from each of the panelists so that we can hear about an example of their work. And then we'll have, I think we'll try to save about 10 minutes for questions. So we'll go, I think, in the same order and start with Sarah. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Did I get unmuted? I unmuted. One of the questions that I faced when I was working in a big law firm back in 1980 was that I had quickly developed an interest in pro bono work. I, in fact, have been on the pro bono committee at my firm pretty much since my third or fourth year as an associate back in the early 1980s. But being an essentially corporate commercial practice, I initially struggled to try to figure out how I could use the skills that I had been developing as a young associate to provide needed pro bono work. And then one day I got a call from, actually it was a partner of mine who recently retired, who at the time was a paralegal at the Volunteer Lawyers Program here in Boston. He contacted me and said that he had a social worker who wanted to form a nonprofit organization, and he wanted it to be tax exempt because he wanted to establish an organization that would provide alcohol and substance abuse recovery services to Spanish-speaking individuals. This was back in the early 1980s. Substance abuse and alcohol abuse was a problem not just in the white community, but also in the Spanish community. And most of the treatment methods used back then involved a lot of speaking, a lot of therapy and group therapy. And so this fellow, Rick Quiroga, came in one day and I met with the paralegal, and he just wanted us to form a nonprofit corporation under Massachusetts law and then help him get tax exempt status. Well, since I had done that for another organization, we thought that would be great. So we helped form this organization known as Casa Esperanza. And we got him his tax exempt status and didn't hear anything for about 6 or 7 months. And I get a call from Rick. Rick says, "Do you know how to help buy a building?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "The mayor's office told me they have a building that they will sell to me for $1 if I can find an architect and a contractor who will fix it up and bring it up to code, and if someone will buy it from me. Do you know anything about that?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I do that kind of work all the time for private developers." So we came in and discovered that, yes, indeed, he had an old building that was in terrible shape that the city was willing to sell to him for $1. but that he needed to go out and try to find out how to raise money, how to borrow money, how to work with a contractor, how to work with an architect. So that began my life of working with Casa Esperanza. Casa Esperanza's initial facility was located on Eustis Street, which is just off of Dudley Square in Boston. And it took us about 2 years to complete that project. I was able to use my experience to obtain obtain bank financing for the project, and get some donations and get a lot of public sector funds that he needed. And then things just started to happen. One of the first things that I had to deal with for Casa's first project was because of the use of the facility as a recovery house, residential recovery house, we needed to get zoning relief from the Boston Board of Appeals. So we filed the appropriate papers to obtain the zoning relief that we needed. It was a conditional use permit. And the hearing was very controversial. You can imagine, here's Rick Quiroga in a neighborhood that was becoming more Black, but Eustis Street, and this part of off of Dudley Square, still was sort of a little enclave of what we called back then lace curtain Irish in Boston. And the several Irish residents of Eustis Street found out what Rick wanted to do. So they contacted their city councilor friend, Dapper O'Neill. I don't know if anybody in this call is old enough to remember who Dapper O'Neill was, but he was quite a colorful character on Boston City Council. So it was a very contentious hearing. I was making the presentation, and we ended up barely getting the vote that we needed. So we got the vote, we got the relief, we built the project and started operating it. Then about 2 years later, Rick wanted to build another project, which he called Latinos and Niños. This is a project where he saw the need for housing for women in recovery with children who spoke Spanish. So we would need to get support once again for zoning relief from Boston City Council. And I said, so Rick, how are we going to deal with the neighborhood? He said, don't worry, I'm working with the neighborhood. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, once we started having people, the guys live in the recovery home, I told them that we needed to be good neighbors. So we started going around and mowing the grass of all the neighbors on the street. We would help some of the elderly residents wash their windows for free, paint their houses. And I even invited one of my neighbors to join the board of directors of Casa Esperanza. So to sort of fast forward about 20 years after that, almost all of Eustis Street now consists of 3/4 way houses, recovery homes, and other treatment facilities run by Casa Esperanza that's providing an incredibly valuable service to the Spanish-speaking population that's suffering from substance abuse and alcohol abuse. I was able to do that because I had a lot of training in corporate law at a big law firm, and I knew how to write bylaws. I knew how to negotiate with lenders. I knew how to negotiate and read financing documents. And we could go and negotiate with title insurance. So my skills as a corporate real estate lawyer, I finally discovered I could use those skills to provide really important services to disadvantaged communities across the Commonwealth. Since then, I've done similar work for other nonprofits that are developing affordable housing and often need help. The other story I want to tell relates to my transition. As you might expect, in big law, there are not many open transgender lawyers. We're a pretty small community nationwide. But I wanted to also be able to use, I don't do advocacy. I'm not a litigator. Lord knows I'm not a litigator. When I was a first-year associate, I had 6 Blue Cross Blue Shield claims that I was defending on behalf of Blue Cross Blue Shield. I lost all of them. I was a terrible litigator. So I didn't want to do that. And so even though I had a lot of personal goals that wanted to further social justice, affordable housing, community development work. I wasn't about to do it through litigation because that was not my strength or my skill, but I could do it in other ways. So one of the things that I've done over the last 12 years since I transitioned is I've continued to use my skills in forming nonprofit corporations and obtaining tax exempt status to help. I can think of 3 or 4 organizations dealing with transgender rights and LGBT rights to help them incorporate, obtain tax exempt status, and to provide themselves some protection and some focus as they've continued to do that. One of the organizations some people here might know is a Wellesley-based organization known as Out Metro West. It's an organization that supports LGBTQ youth, primarily in the middle school age. So I found that very rewarding, that I'm able to use the same skills that I use when I'm negotiating with Bank of America over a $25 million construction loan to help these startup nonprofits obtain tax exempt status and then go and buy a building and open a clubhouse or a facility. And just another quick story. I live in Holliston with my 27-year-old daughter, my 6.5-year-old grandson, who's coming home from kindergarten soon, and my 2 dogs. So I still have a personal life besides practicing law in a big firm with very long hours.
Thank you so much. Love those stories. Okay, next we're going to have Connie, but first I'm going to say I also had to do an LGBTQ legal presentation at my parents' church, and it was like one of the first moments that they were like, oh, this is a good thing, because their Methodist church had like just put out their rainbow flag recently. So I just wanted to be in that club with you.
So that's great. When you're asked to speak at a church, it's always, you never quite know what you're going to get, but it's a wonderful experience. And one of the things that I'm fortunate to do is be able to bring my whole self to my work, and that includes to the courthouse. I'm not a litigator, but I'm down there with other things, filing papers and whatnot. And I'm fairly well known around there of who I am, and, have opportunities to talk to court officials about, why am I filing an adoption when both women's names are on the birth certificate, or both men's names are on the birth certificate since we got marriage equality, and having to do, because the law in North Carolina, as in many states, hasn't caught up with our modern families, all kinds of families, and doing things like that. I told you earlier, I first and foremost, I show up and I use my law degree for my clients. And, doing a name change probably isn't a big deal to most people, but for somebody who is changing from a gendered name to a name that they've chosen for themselves for who they are, is a big deal. And in some counties, I'm in Charlotte, I'm Mecklenburg, we're one of the largest counties in the state. It flows right through, not a problem, no hearings, nothing like that. But you get into the more rural counties and you're just not sure what it is you're going to run into, because there's, as you probably know, there's what the law says, and then there's what actually happens. And, it may be the same thing and it may be a different thing. And so being able to do that for my client, being able to not only accomplish something that's really important to them, but also to be a buffer between the legal system and them, is something that gives me a lot of pleasure and a lot of fulfillment. For parents who have children, and they're doing gender marker changes for their children and name changes for their children, it's just huge. It's who they are, and the parents want them to reflect that. And because I'm fortunate to, belong to like the National LGBT Bar Association and some other groups like that, I can bring to the table some other things that they may not think about. Like, what do you do with selective service if you were assigned male at birth and are female, and things like that? How do you do your driver's license? What do you do with your passport, all your identity documents and things like that? It's really important work to me, and I love doing it. And I'm very fortunate to be able to do that. also sit on what we call the Modern Family Committee. And so we are drafting legislation for whenever our state legislature reaches a point where it has a chance of passing, which is not currently, but eventually we'll get there. And so we have legislation that will update our statutes and reflect families as they actually are. And I'm excited to be a part of that. Nobody should have to adopt their own children, but it's where we're at right now, at least under North Carolina law. The couple of stories a few years ago, there was I'm sure there's more than one, but the case that I was involved with was a kid who was in the Department of Social Services custody, and the kid was transgender, and her psychologist wanted to start her on puberty blockers to kind of hit the pause button based on her age and the foster care situation. And the mom was opposed to it. But again, Department of Social Services had legal custody. And frankly, they didn't know what to do and didn't want to go anywhere near it. But here it is. And the attorney for the psychologist was somebody that I was acquainted with. And I kind of came into the case and wrote a brief for the psychologist supporting the position of the puberty blockers. And the court ultimately did a couple of things. The court did side with the needs of the child, the medical needs of the child. And the court also said to everybody, and this was some years ago, told everybody in the courtroom that they were going to call the young person by their name that they wanted to be called, and use their pronouns, which was huge back then. And although said, mom, you get to do whatever you want to do, but everybody else is going to do this. And I appreciated that a lot. It was huge. It was huge for this family. It was huge for everybody who was in the courtroom. And for me personally, both the psychologist and the attorney were people that I was basically afraid of. I mean, they were a big deal in this town, and I was not a big deal. I was a little deal. And I was very intimidated by them, but they were pretty impressed with my work, the research and writing that I learned in law school. And to this day, I get a homemade pecan pie from that attorney every single year. So that worked out for everybody involved, I suppose. The second one was back before marriage equality. Charlotte, like many towns, Charlotte and our county, Mecklenburg County, were looking at doing domestic partner benefits for their employees. And I was part of a group of people, although I don't work for the city, pushing for the domestic partner benefits as something that was important for the people who were working for the city and the county. And some of the city county members wanted to hide behind the city attorney, who was saying, oh, I don't know if we can do this, blah, blah, blah. And so I did my research and wrote a memo, and the city attorney and I, got going back and forth memo writing. And although not initially, but eventually we did end up getting domestic partner benefits for city employees and for county employees. And I'm very proud of being a part of that process. And again, I said this earlier on, my law degree and my activism are two sides of who I am, and they're a big part of who I am. And it's worked out really well for me. And thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, next we have back to Emily.
So as I mentioned earlier, I use the pen to do a lot of my work. I am also not a litigator, but my push for social justice often comes down to how well I've managed to write something. So I have several stories in that regard. I think maybe the first story, prior to moving back to Belgium, I was working for an organization in Boston called Boston Community Capital, which is now known as Blue Hub Capital, which is run by Elise Cherry. Yes, Sarah, I've met you before. You don't remember. And I got that job through Northeastern. So another reason why you should love Northeastern Law School, great networking opportunities. So I was working with Boston Community Capital as part of their solar program to develop and pilot business models for low-income solar to show that they were profitable and could be financed. And one of the issues in the market still today is that if you have low-income individuals involved in a solar project, banks won't finance it. So you kind of have to prove out a model to make sure it works. So one of the things we had done before I had started, Boston Community Capital already had a solar rooftop, a solar installation on top of the Greater Boston Food Bank, and was helping them save money on their electricity bill. So every dollar or so that they saved, they could provide up to 3 meals to needy families in the region. So they were such big fans of their solar installation that a few years later, they decided to expand it and put another solar installation on their roof. And so we were part of that deal, and we put the solar projects together. And the way we did it from a financing perspective is because these rooftop projects are quite small, you have to sort of bundle them together to get them to be big enough for banks to be interested and to be able to leverage the federal investment tax credit through a special purpose vehicle. So we went through that whole entire process, financed the projects, got the solar panels up and running. And then a few months later, we get a letter from the utility company telling us that the system is not eligible to be a net metering system. That, except for Courtney, who I had seen on this, probably doesn't mean anything to any of you, but net metering is an important mechanism for solar systems to get reimbursed for the electricity that they produce. And if the system couldn't qualify as a net metering system, then there was a huge issue in terms of the economics of the entire deal that actually jeopardized the whole pile of solar projects that we had just financed, not just the arrangement that we had made with the Greater Boston Food Bank. The reason why it didn't qualify was because in the middle of sort of transitioning to build this system, this new rule had come out that said you can only have one net metering system on a single parcel of land. Nobody had really picked up on that rule, including the utilities and all the other lawyers that had been involved in that process. So we had to go to the Department of Public Utilities to get an exception to this rule to see if we could get permission to have 2 net metering solar systems on a single parcel of land. And so that involves, regulatory law and going through this whole process of drafting briefs of why it was in the public interest and researching the other applications that had been submitted to the DPU for exceptions and whether they have been granted and why had they been granted and why haven't they been granted. And writing up the petition and going through the process and the review and questions from the Department of Public Utilities. And through the process discovered my love of regulatory law, spending hours and hours just tweaking sentences and citing cases. I really fell deeply in love with it. And so the good news is, of course, at the end of the entire process, we managed to convince the Department of Public Utilities they couldn't say no to us, that they couldn't deprive the Greater Boston Food Bank of their second net metering system. They could not jeopardize the financing of our entire portfolio of solar projects. And we were granted an exception with the department making clear that, this was the one time they were going to do this. And if anybody else came to them saying, oh, well, we didn't know this was a rule, that it wouldn't fly. So we managed to get our system saved and save some money for the Greater Boston Food Bank and then our other systems, which were on affordable housing development. So that was a very big and exciting victory for our little small universe of people working on solar. And I would just maybe add in, the work I'm sort of doing now, I do a lot of social justice kind of through contracting, believe it or not. Contracts was my least favorite class in law school, but all I do now these days, I think, is write contracts. One of my jobs with Vineyard Wind is to help them implement the programs that they've committed to as part of their winning proposals for offshore wind projects. And so as part of their Vineyard Wind 1 project, they have made a $15 million commitment to a resiliency and affordability program to support low-income ratepayer benefits in solar and energy storage projects on the Cape and the Islands. And one of the things I've had the privilege of doing, given my knowledge and understanding of the solar industry in Massachusetts, is really shape that program by negotiating with our program partners and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, how that program will actually be implemented in practice, and using that as an opportunity to ensure that we're expanding access to solar and addressing the barriers that need to be addressed through the formation of that program, and then making sure it all gets captured appropriately in the contract so everybody knows the rules of the road and that the funds are used to the greatest benefit possible. So that's another thing that I do with my law degree, and absolutely love the work.
Thank you so much. All right, next we have Michelle, my colleague.
Hi, everybody. So what I want to discuss today is a through line, not only in my work on reproductive rights and healthcare, but also across the work that we do at NWLC, which is combating the weaponization of religious freedom as a tool to discriminate and evade the law. And I want to preface this by saying that religious freedom is a fundamental value in our society and a very, very important right. The concern is the misuse of that right in a way that harms others. And a huge portion of my work involves arguments by folks that their religion gives them the right to discriminate against others, excuse me, to refuse to provide healthcare, even in emergency situations, to deny health coverage required by law, and in fact, to avoid having to comply with all sorts of laws, from civil rights laws to public health laws to labor laws and even criminal laws. So I was involved in 3 lawsuits against the Trump administration, challenging regulations that were attacking people who are seeking reproductive health care. And all 3 involved attempts by the Trump administration to expand religious exemptions in a way that would harm others. So I'm really going to focus on one today. And that was a lawsuit that was challenging Trump rules that created sweeping religious and moral exemptions to the ACA's contraceptive coverage requirement, which I will call the birth control benefit. For short. And this is the provision of the ACA that allows birth control to be covered without any copay. And as background, many of you may have heard of the Hobby Lobby case from back in 2014. And in that case, Hobby Lobby brought suit challenging the birth control benefit under a statute called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or RFRA, and under that law, laws that substantially burden religious exercise are subject to strict scrutiny under RFRA. So in a game-changing opinion, the Supreme Court held that for-profit corporations could have religious beliefs and bring suit under RFRA, and it held that the birth control benefit substantially burdened Hobby Lobby's religious exercise, and that it didn't satisfy strict scrutiny. So Justice Ginsburg issued a very prescient dissent in that case, arguing that the court's decision had created a minefield whereby entities would invoke RFRA to avoid complying with all sorts of laws, which is exactly what happened. And I'll drop in the chat after I finish speaking a report that we've issued about the misuse of this decision. Excuse me. So fast forward to 2017, the Trump administration invoked RFRA as a justification to allow any employer, even publicly traded corporations, to unilaterally exempt themselves from the birth control benefit by claiming a religious exemption. And also, all employers except for publicly traded corporations could do so by claiming a vaguely defined moral objection. And so several states and organizations sued, including us at the National Women's Law Center. And unfortunately, although lower courts had preliminarily enjoined these rules, in June of 2020, the Supreme Court allowed them to go back into effect in the case Little Sisters of the Poor versus Pennsylvania. And in that case, the Supreme Court not only held that the ACA authorized these exemptions, it also held that an agency could consider RFRA in its rulemaking, which is a very big deal. So this treatment of RFRA as a super statute that allows religious objectors to refuse to comply with the law will continue to have huge implications for the rule of law beyond reproductive rights. And in fact, last summer, in holding that sex discrimination includes discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity in the Bostock case, Justice Gorsuch's majority opinion included a discussion of RFRA that actually called it a super statute, previewing that religion will really be a major front for LGBTQ civil rights cases as well. So I won't get into the details of the other cases that I worked on, but they also involved attempts to use religious exemptions beyond RFRA to allow healthcare providers and insurers to deny care and coverage to patients and even information to patients. So ultimately, at the end of the day, the people who are most hurt by refusals of care are those who already face disparities in healthcare due to systemic barriers. And those people are so often people of color and women of color in particular. And so many of these issues are ultimately issues of racial justice. I will say that one silver lining in all of this is that it has helped to foster close working relationships across the civil rights movement, particularly with our LGBTQ partners, but also with racial justice and disability justice groups and groups that advocate for religious minorities. And while I'm hopeful that these rules will be reversed by the Biden administration, at the end of the day, the Supreme Court, as it's currently constituted, is very sympathetic to these arguments, which is why I'm still raising them. And we're going to see them going far beyond the context of reproductive health care. So I know we're short on time, so I just want to name just a couple. There's a case before the Supreme Court called Fulton versus City of Philadelphia about whether private agencies that receive taxpayer funding to provide government services can refuse to work with LGBTQ people or religious minorities under the First Amendment. So it's a very big case that you should follow. And I don't have time to get into it, but I also want folks to follow something called the ministerial exemption, which started as a narrow exemption designed to allow houses of worship to control the hiring and firing of clergy, and now has mushroomed into a tool to allow to deny workplace protections for all sorts of employees, such as school teachers at religious schools. So not to end on a depressing note, but these issues are very pressing. And so even with the change in administration, the work still continues. So passing it back to you, Sunu. Thanks, everybody.
Well, I put in a couple links on the ministerial cases, but if you want to put in the one on the Fulton blog or brief, I think that would be helpful for folks. And
yeah, let me see if I could find it.
Thank you. And now we're going to end with Heather. And I know that we're short on time, so please put in your comments and questions in the chat and we can follow up later, but I'm going to give Heather our last 5 minutes. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Wow, Sarah, Connie, Emily, Michelle, you guys are a tough act to follow. You're incredible. I'm just going to tell one story, and that's the story of the reunification of one of my clients and her daughter. Angelica Gonzalez Garcia and her 7-year-old daughter crossed the border in Arizona, fleeing severe violence in Guatemala. I can't go into their asylum case because it's still ongoing, but they had every reason to believe they both would have been murdered had they stayed even one more day in Guatemala. They were arrested by Customs and Border Protection officers. She immediately asked for asylum on behalf of herself and her daughter, but soon after they were transferred to a Customs and Border Protection facility, an officer pulled Angelica aside and said, "I'm going to take your daughter away from you." And Angelica, who'd never slept more than a day next to her daughter since her daughter was born, started sobbing. And with a smirk on his face, this officer said, "Happy Mother's Day," because this was May 2018, right before Mother's Day. And Angelica was instructed to dress her daughter in a prison type uniform. It was kind of these green standard issue outfit. It was too big for her. She was allowed to hug her daughter one final time. And the little girl said, "Am I ever going to see you again?" And Angelica said, "Yes, you will." And the little girl said, "I love you with all of my heart." And they lined her up with a bunch of other children between the ages of about 5 and 12 and marched her out of the facility. And that's when Angelica really lost it for the first time because she was holding it together for her daughter. She did not see her daughter again for 55 days. Angelica was transferred to another facility where she was pretty much immediately released on minimum bond. She made her way to Framingham. She made her way to our office around day 44. And by that time, she's completely traumatized by what she's experienced. Her daughter, she had learned, was in a facility in Texas only because this little girl had memorized a number in Guatemala and called it to say, "Tell my mom, this is where I am," not because the US government contacted her. She'd only spoken to her daughter a couple of times, but she knew that she wasn't doing well. The little girl had turned 8 by herself on the floor of a facility. She had a bruise on her face from another child who had hit her. She contracted conjunctivitis and had a fever, and she was separated from the other children multiple times because she was crying so hard. And so Susan Church and I, my partner and I, immediately went into mama bear mode, contacted the Office of Refugee Resettlement and said, "Okay, we have Angelica here. You have the birth certificate. You know this is the mother. We're going to reunify them." And instead of doing what we expected, which was, "Oh, of course, she's out of custody, you can have the daughter back," they went through this draconian bureaucratic process of, "No, we actually need to approve Angelica as a sponsor of her daughter." And I won't go into the logistics just for time, but essentially this is what happened. when the government didn't lose or deport these children, they basically rubber stamped them with this unaccompanied alien child status, which is an existing status for children that come over the border alone, traditionally 14 to 17-year-old boys, who then go through the process of getting a sponsor, a cousin or an uncle, and wait in a facility for it as the sponsor officially kind of adopts them through the immigration process. What they were doing is making the actual parents go through this same process. And so we're saying things like, you have the birth certificate, we've given you 30-something pages of background checks and information about this woman. And they said, no, we need fingerprints now. And we said, well, they gave you fingerprints at the border. They took the daughter and the mothers. And they said, oh, Customs and Border Protection doesn't share fingerprints with us. We need our own. And we don't have another fingerprint appointment in Boston for 6 weeks. And we said, you're going to let that little girl languish for 6 weeks while her mother is begging for her. And they said, oh, well, maybe 5 weeks if we let you go to New York City to get your fingerprints done. And we said, oh, we're just going to sue the hell out of you. And that's what we did. So we filed a federal lawsuit in Boston demanding the immediate reunification of Angelica and her daughter. And that really did speed things up. We filed with the ACLU, with Nixon Peabody, procedural due process, substantive due process, APA, equal protection, Flores Agreement, all of these things. We had a press conference to just shame the government into keeping this family separated even a moment longer. And eventually we got the fingerprints pretty quickly. It was the 4th of July when I got a phone call from this Office of Refugee Resettlement. Congratulations, we've approved Angelica as the sponsor of this little girl. And we said, that's great. Can she fly up to Boston? They said, yes, just give us about a week to get our paperwork done and we will fly her up. And we said, no, I'm coming down there today. And I got this phone call while I was standing in the Best Buy parking lot with my husband and my 3 children. And I said to my husband, take me to the airport. So we're on the pike from Framingham to Logan Airport. I'm about to stop at Angelica's house to get a fistful of custody documents signed by Angelica, giving me temporary custody of this little girl. And the plan was for me to go there, and if they didn't immediately release this little girl to my custody, I was going to the next closest court in Texas to demand that she be released to me so I can bring her up to Boston to see her mother. And while we were driving to the airport, I get another phone call, don't send your lawyer down here, we'll put her on the next flight. And we have footage of their actual reunion that took place right there, if somebody's able to play it. So for people who don't speak Spanish, it's what she was saying was, forgive me for leaving you alone. Forgive me, my daughter, forgive me. Thank you, God, for returning her to me. Are you okay, my love? You're with mommy now. Everything is okay. What you probably saw was Angelica sobbing, but the little girl just kind of dazed and standing in far off expression. And we saw this over and over again. The older children would be sobbing, but the younger ones, it's like they were just trapped in time with their own trauma. So what we ended up doing is filing a class action lawsuit on behalf of all of the children and their parents separated at the border for money damages to create a fund to have mental health benefits for these children. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Like many of us, I'm also crying, which makes sense. That was very, very moving. Thank you for all of your work in immigration justice and for justice for these kids and their families. And to all the panelists, I think it was really, really wonderful to hear about so many examples of using a law degree for social justice and for good in our families, in our communities, and in the legal setting. So thank you to Miel and everyone for this conference. And you see my little note in the chat about Tracy Lukes. The short version is she encouraged me to pursue poetry which I've been doing on the side. And about a month ago, I won a prize, and we'll have a book coming out of poems in about 2 years. So I put the link to that. So a lot can come from just supporting and encouraging each other in the law and in the rest of our lives. So thank you for creating this space, and over to you, Miel.